3 hours in the hospital before his parents even knew. How long would it take them to notice if their son disappeared from this world? Oh, honey, sit yourself down and let me fix you a glass of my famous sweet tea, extra sugar, just the way I make it. You're gonna need it for this story, because what I'm about to tell you about the Harrison family will have you clutching your pearls like you're at Sunday service, and the preacher just said something scandalous. Now, I know what Harold says about me, that I'm always poking my nose where it doesn't belong. But I tell you what, if being a concerned neighbor who happens to notice things makes me nosy, then guilty as charged. Somebody's got to keep an eye on this neighborhood, and Lord knows it might as well be me. I've got the best view from my kitchen window, after all. The Harrisons moved into that pretty blue house on Cedar Avenue about 5 years back. Beautiful family to look at, mom, dad, 3 boys. But honey, looks can be deceiving, and that family had more drama than a soap opera marathon. I'm telling you, the young and the restless had nothing on the Harrisons. Let me paint you a picture. There was Linda Harrison, pretty woman, always dressed nice even for grocery shopping, but with this look in her eyes like she was constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop. Her husband Michael was one of those corporate types, you know the kind, pressed shirts even on weekends, always checking his phone like the world might end if he missed an email. And child, those 3 boys of theirs were something else. The oldest was Brandon, 17 and full of himself like most teenage boys. Then there was the middle one, Eric, 16, quiet as a church mouse during prayer time. And the baby of the family, Kevin, who was 14 and had more energy than a squirrel on espresso. Now, if you thought Brandon and Kevin would get along like brothers should, honey, you'd be wrong as wrong can be. Those 2 fought like they were competing for the world championship of sibling rivalry. I remember the very first week they moved in. I was being neighborly, you understand, bringing over my famous chocolate chip cookies when I heard this almighty racket coming from their backyard. Sounded like World War III had broken out. I naturally had to investigate, for safety reasons, of course, and there were Brandon and Kevin going at it over a basketball or some such nonsense, while poor Linda was trying to separate them like a referee at a boxing match. But here's what caught my attention, and honey, when something catches my attention, you know it's important. That middle boy, Eric, was just standing there off to the side, holding the plate of cookies I'd brought over like he didn't know what else to do with himself. Not crying for attention, not trying to break up the fight, just existing. And that didn't sit right with me, not one little bit. Harold says I read too much into things, but I've raised 3 children of my own and helped raise 7 grandchildren, so I know a thing or two about family dynamics. And what I saw that day was the beginning of a pattern that would make your heart just ache. Every single morning, and I mean every morning, I'd hear Brandon and Kevin starting up their daily argument. Could be about who got the bathroom first, who ate the last of the cereal, who breathed wrong in the other's direction. Child, those boys could find something to fight about in an empty room. And there'd be Linda, hair still in curlers, trying to make peace while Michael sat at the kitchen table reading his newspaper like nothing was happening. But Eric? That sweet boy would slip out the front door quiet as a shadow, backpack on his shoulders, and walk to school alone while his family was too caught up in the morning drama to even notice he'd left. I started timing it. Took me all of 3 days to realize that child left at the exact same time every morning, 7:43 a.m. sharp, like clockwork. Now, being the observant neighbor that I am, I started noticing other things too. Like how when the family would pile into their minivan for what looked like family outings, half the time they'd get halfway down the street before Linda would suddenly gasp and Michael would have to turn around. And guess who'd come walking out of the house, forgotten again? If you said Eric, give yourself a gold star. The first time I saw it happen, I thought, well, we all make mistakes. The second time, I thought, that's odd. But honey, by the 5th time, I was ready to march over there and give Linda and Michael a piece of my mind. How do you forget a whole child? It's not like he was small enough to misplace like car keys. I mentioned it to Gladys at the beauty parlor. You know Gladys. She does my hair every other Thursday, and she said maybe they were just absent-minded. Absent-minded. I told her, Gladys, honey, being absent-minded is forgetting to buy milk. Forgetting your own child is something else entirely. But the grocery store incidents, oh Lord have mercy, Those were what really got my blood boiling hotter than my cast iron skillet on chicken frying Sunday. I do my shopping every Thursday morning at 10 sharp, have been for 15 years. Everyone knows that. And wouldn't you know it, the Harrisons apparently shopped around the same time. Picture this. There's Linda pushing the cart, Michael checking his phone, probably looking at stock prices or some such foolishness, Brandon and Kevin arguing over whether to get Frosted Flakes or Lucky Charms like it was a matter of life and death. And Eric? That child would be walking along reading the ingredients on everything, quiet as you please, probably learning more about nutrition than his parents ever taught him. But honey, when they get to checkout, drama. The first time I witnessed it, I nearly dropped my eggs. They loaded up all their groceries, Linda fishing through that purse of hers that was big enough to hide a small country, Michael tapping his foot impatiently, Brandon and Kevin still bickering, and they just walked out. Left Eric standing there by the cart like he was part of the grocery store fixtures. I cleared my throat so loud I probably scared customers 3 aisles over. Linda Harrison. I called out in my best church lady voice. I believe you're forgetting something rather important. The look on that woman's face when she turned around. Like she'd seen a ghost, I tell you. And poor Eric just smiled that sad little smile and said, "It's okay, Mrs. Mel. Happens all the time." Happens all the time. What kind of thing is that for a 16-year-old boy to say? Made my heart hurt worse than when I threw out my back trying to rearrange my living room furniture without Harold's help. After that, I made it my business to be at the grocery store whenever I saw their minivan in the parking lot. Call it divine providence or just good timing, but somebody needed to make sure that child didn't get left behind like yesterday's newspaper. Now, let me tell you about the Davies family. Different story entirely. Sarah Davies and her husband Tom lived right across from the Harrisons, and their boy Nathan was about Eric's age. Sarah Davies, bless her sweet heart, was one of those women who collected stray children like some people collect stamps. Her door was always open, cookie jar always full, and she had this way of making every child feel like they were the most special person in the world. I noticed early on that Eric and Nathan had become thick as thieves. Every day after school, instead of going straight home, Eric would end up at the Davies house. Smart boy, if you ask me. He figured out where the love was and went straight to it like a bee to honey. Sarah, being the angel she was, never turned him away. I'd see her through her kitchen window, which happened to be visible from my sewing room window. Pure coincidence, I assure you, helping both boys with homework, making them snacks, treating Eric like he was her own. That woman had a heart bigger than Texas and twice as warm. But here's the thing that really got me worked up, and when I get worked up, Harold knows to just hand me my knitting and let me stitch my feelings out. Eric's own parents didn't even notice where he was spending his time. That child could have been halfway to Mexico, and they wouldn't have known the difference. I saw it with my own 2 eyes one evening. I was out front watering my azaleas. They need extra attention in the heat, you know, when I saw Michael Harrison come home from work. He walked right past Eric, who was sitting on the Davies' front porch with Nathan, without even a glance. Didn't wave, didn't call out hello, nothing. Like the boy was invisible. Then, about an hour later, I heard Linda calling for Eric to come to dinner. Calling and calling, getting more frantic each time. And where was Eric? Still on the Davies' porch, clear as day, probably waiting to see how long it would take for someone to actually look for him instead of just yelling his name. I tell you, it took every ounce of Christian charity in my body not to march over there and say, "Linda Harrison, your son is 50 feet away." Maybe if you spent less time referencing Brandon and Kevin's fights and more time counting your children, you'd know that. But the worst incident, and honey, when I say worst, I mean it made me madder than the time Harold used my good sewing scissors to cut fishing line, happened at the mall. Now, I don't usually go to the mall, but my granddaughter Precious wanted some of those fancy hair accessories for her birthday, and you know I can't say no to that child. I was walking through the food court, minding my own business. Yes, I do that sometimes, despite what Harold says, when I spotted the whole Harrison crew by the pizza place. Same old story. Brandon and Kevin arguing about something ridiculous, probably about who got more pepperoni on their slice, when suddenly they both went storming off in different directions. Linda went chasing after Brandon, Michael went after Kevin, and guess who they left standing there holding the shopping bags? If you guessed Eric, you're learning how the story goes. That poor child stood there for 1 hour. I know because I sat myself down at a table where I could keep an eye on him. Somebody had to. He kept checking his phone, looking around hopefully, like maybe this time they'd remember him. It broke my heart into more pieces than my good china when Harold's nephew knocked over my display cabinet. After an hour and 15 minutes, yes, I was counting, I couldn't take it anymore. I walked over and said, "Eric, honey, where's your family?" You know what that child said to me? He said, "They probably went home." "It's okay, Mrs. Mel. I'll call someone for a ride." Like it was the most normal thing in the world. I was about ready to call Child Protective Services right then and there, but then I saw Sarah Davies coming around the corner with Nathan. The look on Sarah's face when she saw Eric standing there alone, honey, if looks could kill, the Harrison parents would have dropped dead wherever they were. She didn't say much to me, just wrapped her arm around Eric and said, "Come on, sweetheart, let's get you home." I followed them to the parking lot, discreetly, of course. I know how to be subtle when necessary, and I heard Sarah on the phone. Must have been talking to Linda, and let me tell you, that sweet, kind woman had a tone that could freeze hell over. Professional, cold, and absolutely done with the nonsense. After that mall incident, things started changing. Eric spent even more time at the Davies house. Might as well have moved in, honestly. I'd see him heading over there straight after school, staying for dinner, sometimes not going home until after dark. And his parents? They didn't seem to notice or care. Oh, but they noticed Brandon and Kevin. Every little thing those boys did was a federal case. I once watched Linda spend 45 minutes mediating an argument about whose turn it was to take out the trash. 45 minutes. Meanwhile, Eric had taken out the trash, cleaned the kitchen, and gone back to the Davies house before she even noticed. Harold told me I was getting too invested in the Harrison family drama. I told him, "Harold Eugene Melville, when a child is being neglected right under our noses, getting invested is the Christian thing to do." That shut him up right quick. He knows better than to argue with me when I use his full name. The turning point, and honey, this is where you might want to take a big sip of that sweet tea, came on a Tuesday evening in late spring. I was in my kitchen making my famous tuna casserole, Harold's favorite, though he'll never admit it in public, when I heard sirens. Now, sirens aren't unusual, but these were close. Real close. I did what any concerned citizen would do. I went to investigate. And Lord have mercy, there was an ambulance right in front of the Davies house. My heart nearly stopped. Sarah Davies was such a good woman, I couldn't bear the thought of something happening to her. But as I watched from my front porch, maintaining a respectful distance, of course, they brought Eric out on a stretcher. That poor baby was white as my good Sunday sheets, hooked up to all kinds of machines, with Sarah right beside him holding his hand and talking to him in that soothing voice of hers. I found out later from Margaret, who works at the hospital, she's in my Tuesday night Bible study group, that Eric had a severe allergic reaction. Apparently, he'd been eating dinner at the Davies house when it happened. Thank the good Lord above that Sarah recognized the signs and got him help immediately. But here's the part that makes my blood pressure spike higher than it did when I found out they discontinued my favorite shade of lipstick. Linda and Michael Harrison didn't even know their son was in the hospital. Sarah had been trying to reach them for 3 hours. 3. What kind of parents don't answer their phone for 3 hours? It was Tom Davies who finally had to drive over to their house. I saw him pull up, and honey, that man was madder than a wet cat in a thunderstorm. He pounded on that door like he was trying to break it down. When Michael finally answered, I could hear Tom's voice from my porch, and Tom Davies is usually such a soft-spoken man. The Harrisons came flying out of that house like their hair was on fire, jumped in their car, and sped off to the hospital. But child, the damage was done. Their son had been fighting for his life, and they'd been sitting at home, probably mediating another Brandon and Kevin dispute, completely clueless. Eric ended up being fine, thank the Lord, but things were never the same after that. When they brought him home the next day, I made sure to be watering my front garden. Those petunias weren't going to water themselves, after all. That's when I heard the conversation that made even me, and I've heard some things in my 68 years, clutch my chest. Eric, sweet, quiet Eric, finally let his parents have it. And when I say have it, I mean he gave them the what for like I've never heard. His voice was shaking with years of pent-up hurt and anger. I couldn't catch every word, but I heard enough. Something about how they wouldn't notice if he disappeared, how they only had eyes for Brandon and Kevin, how he could die, and they'd probably forget to come to the funeral. Lord have mercy. The silence that followed was so heavy you could have cut it with a butter knife. Even Brandon and Kevin, for once in their lives, had nothing to say. Things got real different after that. The Harrison house, which was usually filled with the sounds of arguing and drama, got quiet. But not a good quiet. It was the kind of quiet that comes before a storm, you know what I mean? Eric started spending even more time away from home, barely speaking to his parents, looking at colleges as far away as possible. I overheard him talking to Nathan Davies in the Davies backyard one evening. I was trimming my hedges, which happened to run along the property line. Pure coincidence. He was talking about boarding schools, about getting out, about never coming back. And honey, the determination in that child's voice, he wasn't playing around. The acceptance letter came on a Thursday, I remember, because I was coming back from grocery shopping when I saw the mailman deliver it. Thick envelope, fancy school crest on the return address. Eric must have been watching for it because he was at that mailbox before the mail truck even pulled away. The look on his face when he opened that letter, it was like watching a prisoner find out he'd been pardoned. Pure relief mixed with joy, mixed with something else, maybe a little sadness that it had come to this. That evening, the Harrison house exploded. And I mean exploded. I could hear the shouting from my living room with the windows closed and the TV on. Linda was crying, Michael was yelling, and for once, Brandon and Kevin were silent as church mice. But Eric? That boy held his ground. I couldn't make out all the words, but the message was clear. He was leaving, and nothing they said was going to change his mind. The weeks before Eric left for boarding school were tenser than my girdle at Thanksgiving dinner. Linda kept trying to corner Eric for heart-to-heart talks, buying him things, making his favorite foods. Too little, too late, if you ask me. You can't ignore a child for 16 years and then expect a few weeks of attention to make up for it. The day Eric left, I made sure to be out front, checking my mail. Yes, I know the mail comes at 2 p.m. and it was 8 a.m., but that's beside the point. Sarah Davies was there, giving Eric the longest hug, telling him how proud she was, probably slipping him some spending money too. Linda was sobbing. Michael looked like someone had punched him in the gut, and Brandon and Kevin just stood there looking confused, like they'd finally realized they had another brother. Eric looked back at that house once before getting in the car. The expression on his face, honey, it wasn't hatred or anger. It was worse than that. It was indifference. Like he was looking at a house he'd once driven by, not the place where he'd grown up. After Eric left, the Harrison house got even stranger. Without him there as the invisible buffer, Brandon and Kevin's fights got worse. Linda started seeing a therapist, I know, because I saw her car at Dr. Peterson's office every Wednesday at 3 p.m. His office is right next to my dentist. Michael started working even longer hours, probably to avoid coming home to the chaos. Eric would call on Sundays. Sarah Davies told me that much when I ran into her at the pharmacy. But the calls were short, polite, distant. He was thriving at school, making friends, joining clubs, finally getting to be the person he'd never been allowed to be at home. Then came that horrible night in November. Honey, I still can't talk about it without getting all emotional. Harold woke me up around 2 a.m., said he smelled smoke. Now, Harold's got a nose like a bloodhound, so when he says he smells something, you best believe it's there. We looked out our bedroom window, and the Harrison house was on fire. Not a little kitchen fire, mind you. The whole house was going up like a Roman candle on the 4th of July. The flames were shooting out of every window. The smoke, so thick you couldn't see the stars. Harold called 911 while I threw on my robe and slippers. By the time we got outside, half the neighborhood was out there in their nightclothes, watching in horror. The fire trucks came screaming down our quiet street, but honey, we all knew. We all knew it was too late. The firefighters did their best, but that old house went up fast. These houses were built in the 40s, all wood and old insulation. Once a fire gets going, it's like trying to stop a freight train with your bare hands. It took hours to get the fire under control. We all stood there, neighbors huddled together, watching the Harrison house disappear before our eyes. Someone brought out coffee, someone else brought blankets, but nobody really spoke. What was there to say? When the fire chief finally came over to give us an update, his face said it all. Linda, Michael, and Brandon, all gone. The smoke had gotten them in their sleep, which was a mercy, I suppose. They never knew what happened. But Kevin, thank the Lord for small miracles, had been at a sleepover at his friend's house. Pure chance, the kind that makes you believe in guardian angels. That poor child came home the next morning to find his whole world gone, reduced to ashes and memories. I'll never forget the sound that boy made when he saw what was left of his house. It came from somewhere deep in his soul, a sound no 14-year-old should ever have to make. Sarah Davies was right there, caught him before his knees hit the ground, wrapped him up in her arms like she was trying to hold his pieces together. Eric came home immediately, of course. 17 years old and suddenly the head of what was left of his family. The boy who'd been forgotten for so long was now the one everyone was depending on. Life's funny that way, isn't it? And by funny, I mean heartbreaking. The funeral was the saddest thing I've ever attended, and honey, at my age, I've been to more funerals than I care to count. The whole neighborhood turned out, plus family from out of state, Eric's boarding school friends, everyone who'd ever known the Harrisons. Eric stood at that graveside holding Kevin's hand, both of them looking lost in their dark suits. Sarah and Tom Davies flanked them like guardian angels, making sure they weren't alone. Eric gave a eulogy that would have made a grown man cry, and it did. I saw Harold wiping his eyes when he thought nobody was looking. What struck me most was how Eric talked about his parents and Brandon. There was love there, buried under all that hurt and neglect. He talked about how his mom made the best chocolate chip cookies, how his dad taught him to ride a bike, how Brandon had protected him from bullies in elementary school before everything went wrong. It was like he was mourning not just the family he'd lost, but the family they could have been. After the funeral, there was no question about where the boys would go. Sarah and Tom Davies took them in without a second thought. Not officially adopted right away, there was paperwork and legal stuff to sort out, but those boys had a home with the Davies family for as long as they needed it. Eric went back to boarding school after a few weeks, but he was different. More serious, more focused, like he was studying not just for himself, but for Kevin too. He'd call every few days to check on his little brother, came home more often on weekends, started acting like the big brother he'd never really had the chance to be before. Kevin struggled more. That poor child had survivor's guilt, something terrible. He'd have nightmares, wake up screaming, sometimes forget where he was. Sarah Davies, bless her patient heart, would sit with him for hours, holding him while he cried, reminding him he was safe. The fire investigation said it was electrical, some old lamp in the living room with faulty wiring. These old houses, beautiful as they are, can be death traps if you don't maintain them properly. One spark, one moment, and a whole family was gone. But here's the thing that always bothered me, something I noticed, but never said out loud until now. Kevin never talked about that night at the sleepover. Oh, he'd talk around it, but never about it directly. And sometimes, when he thought nobody was looking, he'd get this expression on his face. I can't quite describe it. Guilty, maybe? Scared? Like he was carrying a secret too heavy for his young shoulders. I mentioned it once to Harold, and he told me I was being ridiculous, that the boy was just traumatized. And maybe he was right. Lord knows that child had been through enough. But still, sometimes I wonder. The empty lot where the Harrison house used to stand stayed vacant for years. Nobody wanted to build there. Too much sadness soaked into that ground. Weeds grew up through the foundation, and wildflowers too. Kevin would sometimes stand at the fence, just looking at that empty space, and Eric would come find him and lead him gently away. Both boys grew up good, despite everything. Eric became a doctor, can you imagine? That forgotten middle child, saving lives and healing people. He said once that he wanted to be the person who noticed when something was wrong, who paid attention to the quiet ones. Made my old heart swell with pride like he was my own grandson. Kevin found his path too, though it took longer. He became a firefighter, of all things. Said he wanted to save families from what happened to his. Sarah Davies cried happy tears the day he graduated from the fire academy. Tom was there too, proud as any father could be. They still come back to visit the neighborhood, both of them. Eric will stop by and check my blood pressure, lecture me about my sweet tea consumption, as if I'm going to change at my age. Kevin will help Harold with yard work, strong and steady, though he still gets quiet sometimes, still carries that weight. But let me tell you some things I haven't mentioned yet, things that still keep me up at night sometimes when the house is quiet and Harold snoring like a freight train. There was this one Christmas, must have been 2 years before the fire, that really showed me just how bad things were for poor Eric. Now, I always make it my business to know what's happening during the holidays. Not being nosy, mind you, just being neighborly. I happened to be at my living room window hanging my special Christmas curtains, the ones with the little bells that Harold says are too loud, but I think are festive, when I saw the Harrison family's Christmas morning. Brandon got a fancy new gaming system. I could hear him whooping and hollering from my house. Kevin got a bicycle, bright red and shiny. And Eric? That child got a gift card. A gift card. To a bookstore. Now, don't get me wrong, books are wonderful, but when your brothers are getting expensive electronics and bikes and you get a piece of plastic, the look on that boy's face, he tried to smile and say thank you, but honey, I saw him slip out to the backyard later and just sit on the swing set by himself. Sarah Davies must have noticed too because that afternoon, she sent Nathan over with a wrapped present for Eric. Said it was something they'd forgotten to give him earlier. It was a beautiful leather journal and a fancy pen set. That woman always knew how to make things right without making a fuss about it. Oh, and speaking of Sarah Davies, let me tell you about the time she almost lost it on Linda Harrison. This was about 6 months before the fire, and honey, it was better than any reality TV show you could imagine. It was at the neighborhood block party. You know, the one we have every summer where everyone brings a dish and pretends they like each other for a few hours. Well, I was setting up my famous potato salad, the one that won the county fair blue ribbon 3 years running, not to brag, when I heard raised voices by the dessert table. Sarah Davies, sweet Sarah who never raised her voice to anyone, was standing toe-to-toe with Linda Harrison, and her face was redder than my tomatoes in August. Apparently, Linda had made some comment about how nice it was that Sarah helped out with Eric sometimes, like she was doing them some kind of favor. Well, honey, Sarah let her have it. Not yelling, mind you. Sarah was too classy for that. But her voice was cold enough to freeze hell over twice. She said something like, someone has to make sure that boy knows he's valued, since his own family can't seem to remember he exists. The whole party went quiet. Even Mr. Peterson stopped flipping burgers to stare. Linda went white as a sheet, then red as a beet, then grabbed Michael's arm and stormed off. They left their own potato salad behind. It wasn't very good anyway. Too much mayonnaise, not enough mustard, but I digress. After that confrontation, things got even more awkward on our street. Linda started avoiding Sarah, would actually cross to the other side of the street if she saw her coming. Like a child. Meanwhile, Eric practically lived at the Davies house. I think Linda knew she'd lost any claim to that boy's heart, and it was her own fault. Now, let me tell you about another incident that just about broke my heart clean in two. It was Eric's birthday, his 16th birthday, which should be special for any child. I know because I mark all the neighborhood children's birthdays in my calendar. It's only polite to wish them well, after all. I was frosting a chocolate cake, Eric's favorite. I'd found out from careful observation, planning to take it over later, when I noticed the Harrison house was awful quiet. No balloons, no decorations, no signs of a birthday celebration at all. I thought maybe they were planning a surprise party later. Well, honey, there was no party. No cake. No nothing. That evening, I saw Eric come home from school, check the mailbox hopefully, then go inside. About an hour later, he came back out and walked over to the Davies house. Sarah opened the door, took one look at his face, and pulled him into the biggest hug. Turns out, and I learned this from Sarah later when we were having coffee, his parents had forgotten his birthday entirely. forgot their child's 16th birthday. They were so caught up in some drama with Brandon getting suspended from school for fighting that Eric's birthday just slipped their minds. Sarah threw together an impromptu celebration, bless her heart. Called a few of Eric's friends from school, made a cake from a box mix, even ran out to get some presents. When I found out what was happening, I marched right over with my chocolate cake and acted like I'd been invited all along. Sometimes you have to insert yourself into situations. That's what I always say. The look on Eric's face when we all sang happy birthday to him, it was like he couldn't believe people had remembered. A child shouldn't look surprised that people care about their birthday. It's not natural. But here's the part that really got me. Around 9 p.m., Michael Harrison came over looking for Eric. Seemed they'd finally realized what day it was. He stood in the Davies' doorway, all sheepish and embarrassed, trying to get Eric to come home so they could celebrate properly. Eric just looked at him and said, "It's okay, Dad. I'm good here." And Michael didn't even fight it, just nodded and left. What kind of father doesn't fight for his son's birthday? Harold would have dragged our boys home by their ears if they'd tried something like that, but Harold's a different kind of man altogether. Then there was the incident with the school play. Oh honey, this one still makes me madder than a hornet in a rainstorm. Eric got the lead role in the spring musical. Yes, that quiet boy could sing like an angel. Who knew? Well, Sarah Davies knew because she'd heard him practicing at her house, but his own parents had no idea their son could carry a tune. I was so excited for him. Bought my ticket the first day they went on sale. Got Harold to buy one too. He grumbled, but he went. Sarah and Tom Davies were there, of course, sitting in the front row with flowers. Nathan had made a big sign that said, "Eric's the star," in glittery letters. But Linda and Michael? Nowhere to be seen. That child scanned the audience during intermission. I saw him looking, searching for his parents' faces. Sarah noticed too and sent Tom out to the lobby to call them. Turns out they were at home dealing with another Brandon and Kevin crisis. Something about a broken window and whose fault it was. Eric performed beautifully, got a standing ovation and everything. But afterwards, when all the other kids were getting hugs and flowers from their families, Eric just stood there until the Davies family surrounded him with enough love for 10 families. I gave him my flowers too, couldn't stand to see him empty-handed. You know what Linda said when I casually mentioned missing her at Eric's big performance? She said, "Oh, was that last night?" We had so much going on. So much going on. Your child is the star of the school play, and you have so much going on that you can't be bothered to show up. I had to go home and take my blood pressure medication after that conversation. And don't even get me started on the driving situation. When Eric turned 16 and got his license, after Sarah Davies spent hours teaching him because his parents were too busy, he asked to borrow the family car to go to a study group. Linda said no because Brandon might need it. Might need it. Not did need it, but might. I watched that boy's shoulders slump as he walked back to his room. Not 5 minutes later, Brandon decided he didn't want to go anywhere after all. But did they call Eric back and say he could use the car? Of course not. That would require them to remember he'd asked in the first place. Sarah ended up letting Eric borrow her car whenever he needed it. That woman was more of a mother to him than the one who gave birth to him, and everyone on the street knew it. Even Gladys at the beauty shop, who usually minds her own business, said it was a crying shame. Oh, and here's something that really showed me how bad things were: the family portraits. You know how I am about photos, always documenting everything. Well, I noticed that the Harrisons had these family photos in their living room window. You could see them from the street if you looked carefully, which I did for neighborhood safety reasons. There was one big portrait from about 5 years ago, all 5 of them dressed up nice. Then newer ones started appearing, but honey, Eric wasn't in half of them. There'd be photos of Brandon at his basketball games, Kevin at his science fair, Linda and Michael at some work function, Brandon and Kevin on vacation. But where was Eric? I mentioned it once to Linda when she was getting her mail. Just a casual observation, you understand. Oh, she said, Eric doesn't like having his picture taken. Doesn't like it? Or wasn't invited to be in them? Because I'd seen that boy posing happily for photos at the Davies house plenty of times. The week before Eric left for boarding school was something else entirely. The atmosphere on our street was so tense you could have cut it with a butter knife and served it on toast. Linda suddenly wanted to do all these mother-son activities with Eric: shopping trips, lunches out, movie nights. 16 years too late, if you ask me. I saw Eric politely declining most of these invitations. Not rudely, that boy was too well-mannered for that, but firmly. Thanks, Mom, but I have plans with Nathan, or I need to pack, or Sarah's helping me with my school shopping. Each excuse was another nail in the coffin of their relationship. Michael tried too, in his own awkward way. I saw him out in the driveway one evening, trying to teach Eric about car maintenance. Eric stood there patiently, listening, but you could tell his heart wasn't in it. How do you teach a boy about checking oil when you never check to see if he made it home safely? The morning Eric left for school, and yes, I was watching from my window, somebody had to witness this boy's liberation, was like a funeral and a celebration all mixed together. The Davies family was there bright and early, Tom loading Eric's bags into their car, because of course they were the ones driving him to school, not his parents. Linda was crying those big dramatic tears, the kind that seem more for show than genuine emotion. She kept trying to hug Eric, and he let her, but briefly, like he was humoring a distant relative at a family reunion. Michael stood there looking lost, like he'd just realized he'd had 3 sons, not 2. Brandon and Kevin, for once in their lives, seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. I saw Brandon try to shake Eric's hand, then pull him into an awkward hug. Kevin just stood there looking confused, like he couldn't understand why his brother was leaving. But the moment that really got me, and I'm not ashamed to admit I teared up a little, was when Eric hugged Sarah Davies. That woman held him like he was going off to war, whispering something in his ear that made him smile through his own tears. That was the goodbye that mattered, the one from the mother who'd chosen him when his birth mother couldn't be bothered. After Eric left, I kept a close eye on the Harrison house. Someone had to, for the neighborhood watch records. The family dynamic shifted dramatically. Without Eric there as the forgotten buffer, Brandon and Kevin's fights escalated to new levels. I'm talking police might need to be called levels. One night, about 2 weeks after Eric left, I heard such a commotion that Harold actually got up to look. Brandon and Kevin were in the front yard, actually physically fighting this time, not just yelling. Michael was trying to separate them while Linda stood on the porch wringing her hands and crying. You know who would have quietly resolved that situation before it got to that point? Eric. That boy had spent years learning how to defuse his brother's fights, redirect their anger, keep the peace. Without him there, the family fell apart like a house of cards in a hurricane. I started noticing other things too. Linda began looking haggard, more so than usual. She'd wander out to get the mail in her bathrobe at 2 in the afternoon, hair uncombed, looking like she'd lost something but couldn't remember what. Michael started coming home later and later from work. Can't say I blame him. Who'd want to come home to that chaos? The last neighborhood gathering before the fire, a Halloween party at the community center, was telling. The Harrisons showed up late, of course. Brandon and Kevin immediately got into an argument about their costumes. They'd both decided to be the same superhero. Can you imagine the drama? Linda looked like she'd aged 10 years in 2 months, and Michael spent the whole party on his phone in the corner. But what I really noticed, they'd brought a store-bought pie. Now, that might not seem significant to you, but Linda Harrison had always prided herself on her homemade contributions to neighborhood events. The fact that she grabbed something from the grocery store told me everything I needed to know about the state of that household. I overheard Margaret from the next street over ask Linda about Eric, how he was doing at school. Linda got this blank look for a moment, like she'd forgotten she had another son, before launching into some generic response about him doing well and adjusting nicely. She didn't mention his grades, his new friends, his role in the school debate team, all things Sarah Davies had told me about with genuine pride. That's the tragedy of it all, really. Eric had become everything a parent should be proud of: smart, kind, talented, resilient, and his own parents knew none of it. They'd been so busy putting out fires between Brandon and Kevin that they'd let their middle child slip away like smoke through their fingers. And that's the story, honey. A family torn apart by neglect and tragedy. Two boys who survived when they shouldn't have, and a neighborhood that learned a hard lesson about paying attention to the ones who don't demand it. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, I sit on my porch and think about Linda and Michael Harrison. I think about all those opportunities they missed to see Eric, to really see him. I think about how different things might have been if they'd just noticed. Counted to 3 at the dinner table. Looked in the rearview mirror one more time. But you can't change the past, can you? All you can do is learn from it. And let me tell you, I learned. Now when I see a quiet child, a forgotten child, an overlooked child, I make sure someone's paying attention. Call me nosy if you want, but sometimes being nosy saves lives. The Harrison tragedy taught this whole neighborhood that love isn't just about the squeaky wheels that demand attention. It's about making sure everyone in your family knows they matter, knows they're seen, knows they're counted. Well, would you look at that? Your glass is empty again. Let me pour you one more. These stories go down easier with sweet tea, don't they? And honey, in this neighborhood, there's always another story to tell. But the Harrison family? That one stays with you. That one changes you. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to go check on my pot roast and see what Harold's up to. That man better not be using my good scissors on his fishing line again.